So this will be our final talk for today. The beer space is filled with all kinds of personalities, as you guys know, all kinds of different business models, different beer styles. Variety is truly all around us. The entrepreneurs who started brewing in their front yard and launched themselves into an unfamiliar space are to be applauded. So there's one guy that I really respect and appreciate, who's not necessarily the guy who was brewing in his front yard and just decided to start a beer brand, and that's Chris Lohring. He's been around the space for a while. He went on hiatus for a little bit and came back to the beer space, but only because he could identify a niche and only because he had an idea that he could be a first mover on. And that's why we brought him here today, to talk about how important it is to have an idea that you can be first to market with in some regards, and really have a concept that you can wrap your brand around if you want to scale to a national level. So Chris, come on out. Thanks.
Need a beer?
Double fisting. Now, it's just when it rains, it pours, I guess, right?
You wholly overestimated my ability to keep people awake at 5 in the afternoon.
Chris, thank you for coming to join us. For those of the folks that don't know you yet, why don't you share a little bit about your story, because I think it's an interesting one, and talk to me about how Notch came to life.
Sure. So, for guys who know me, or guys and women that know me in the crowd, I've been a local brewer in the Boston scene for a long time. I started Tremont Brewery in 1993 in the Charlestown neighborhood. We grew the company to the second largest brewer in Massachusetts, behind Harpoon, within 5 years. We withstood the shakeout of the late 90s, early 2000s, and then based on some decisions that were made from myself, my partner, and my investors, we decided to sell and get out of the company, get out of the business. And so I took a breather for a number of years, and I promised myself I wouldn't get back in unless I had something that was really unique, differentiated, and ultimately relevant to the consumer. And so I stood in the sidelines for a while, and during this time I became a consumer again, and as a consumer I realized the beers I really loved just weren't available, that session beers, as I called them and knew them as a brewer, they were just non-existent. I was drinking Pilsner Kel because it was the only thing I could find that was of moderate alcohol, that was reasonably fresh and decent, and even that was a compromise. So, I started developing the plan in 2009 based around a modest alcohol session beer concept. And at the time, everyone I talked to, brewer friends, et cetera, thought I was nuts. The industry was going the absolute opposite way. And I understood that because there's a lot of margin, there's a lot of excitement around higher alcohol beers, and that was driving a lot of not only consumer excitement, but wholesaler excitement and retailer excitement. But I kept looking at this saying, well, there's a real opportunity to do something that could be a volume mover within craft beer. I mean, session beer, you can have one when you didn't think you could. I mean, that leads to additional occasions to drink beer. And wouldn't we want to be looking at an opportunity to increase the segment with another option? And so it was through that time as a consumer again that I really had this epiphany about session beer as being a reason to jump back into the industry.
You clearly identified a need for you personally as a consumer, but how about the trend in general? Now it seems to have taken off, and there's plenty of other craft brewers that are at least making one or two session-style offerings, or putting the word session on their package. Did you ever envision this, 4 years ago when you were getting started?
No, my whole goal when I started was just to get session beer into the conversation. It really was, just to have brewers start thinking about it again. We are in a time now of great creativity within craft beer, and I didn't understand why this creativity couldn't be funneled to a segment that could create also great volume. And so, I'll always have competition. I mean, I was the first one to start a session beer company, and I'm not alone in that space anymore. And there's been a whole bunch of entries into session beer this year. They've all been, focused around IPA, for better or worse. But I had to live within that competitive environment. If this was going to be successful, I wasn't going to be the only one doing it. And that would have been, foolish to think that.
So you think it's definitely helped you to have those other folks alongside you?
I think Founders, more than any other company or any other brewer in the country, did more for session beer than I ever could. They have legitimacy and credibility at a very high level. And for them to come out with a session-focused beer, brought that credibility overnight. And then the other thing that it did, it showed people that volume was available within session beer as well. It became, an obscene amount of their business right away.
Right.
And all of a sudden, every other brewer was like, "Oh, this might be a pretty good idea." And so that was kind of I think the wave that started everyone kind of focusing on session beers. Again, but we've all most have focused on session IPA, which, I think is going to, for the consumer standpoint, it's going to get a little tired if that's all we come out with session beer. There's a whole, I've made 25 beers to date that are all under 4.5% alcohol, and one could be considered an IPA. So we're only scratching the surface of what we could do in that category.
Interesting. Locally, there's not a conversation that's had about session without Notch coming up. And you've been able to build quite a following here in the last few years. What have been the keys to your success here in Massachusetts and in other parts of New England? And, what's the next step that you guys need to take in your sort of business life cycle?
Yeah, I think the key to success has been a couple things. One is that it's come from a real place, as some people have said earlier today, an authentic place. I mean, this came from a brewer standpoint. As someone at the end of the day, when I was brewing, I went to the tap and didn't grab the 7% IPA. I got the lowest ABV on the tap because that's what I wanted to refresh myself at the end of a really hard day. And so from a brewer standpoint, that's how I think about beer. I like to drink beer. I don't like to sip it. And so this personal thing as being a brewer kind of like manifested itself into the brand. And I think people saw that as like not something that was handed down from a marketing, directive from a large company, like, hey, this is a good category to go after. Let's see what's going on there. So I think there's it comes from a real place. And the other is that I worked hard on communication to the consumer and what session beer was all about. And I went to a friend of mine who did work with me at Tremont for marketing and branding to help me really define how we were going to communicate what session beer was to the consumer. Because I didn't have an idea about how to do that. I came from a brewer standpoint, like low alcohol, it's great. That doesn't resonate with the consumer. You say 4 years ago, you said low alcohol to a craft beer consumer, they looked at you like you were green. Like, what are you talking about? So we had to, the way we coached that term was to use one that already existed in Britain, which was session.
Right. And early on, you had told me that, that was a partnership that you developed with a branding agency that really helped you hone in on your packaging and just the message that you were out there. How critical was it for you to have that partner at the very early stages of development as opposed to later, trying to, do it yourself, at least in the beginning?
I think I learned a lot from my mistakes with Tremont, where we were very much a do-it-yourself brewery. We did everything. Everything ourselves, including our distribution. It was a kind of like punk rock aesthetic. I was in my mid-20s, and we were gonna do it all. And I realized that is a quick path to showing what you're not good at. And so this time around, I wanted to make sure that I brought in other people that could help me succeed by having other expertise and other people to help me grow the brand and the idea. So.
Right. Do you see Notch as a national brand at some point?
It's really funny to be sitting here talking about Notch as a national brand in the session category, where 4 years ago people didn't think I was going to last 2 months. I say that jokingly, but it's true. People didn't. I mean, if you lived, through what I lived 4 years ago and saw the looks on some faces of people who were trying to get their head around the benefit of session beer and how it's great at different occasions, I couldn't cut through that clutter. So now sitting here today saying 4 years later that could be a national brand. I didn't set it up as a local regionalized brand. It's not named after a city. I don't name my beers after locales. And those are perfectly valid and really good, I think, ways to drive down locally. But for me, I wanted it to be more than that. I wanted to have an aesthetic with the brand or the beer that was a little bit more Americana. The Americana, really shows through in the brand, because I wanted to have an American session beer brand. And so it was more about the beer and less about where it came from. Because I'm a contract brewer. Although I'm very active, I do the recipes and I do brewing in some of the locations and I oversee at others. For me, that authenticity was important. But yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Do you think the contract? Speaking of contract, do you think that lends itself to greater ability to become a national brand? Because now there are some contract breweries coming into the space. I think of like Brew Hub, and their whole sort of vision and plan is to have these breweries across the country. And it seems like it would really lend itself to a model like yours, where you can kind of plug it in and start moving across the country with them?
Yeah, I think as a category, as an industry, we've gotten away from the fact that contract equals bad. Contract can still equal bad if in the hands of the wrong people. In the 90s, contract brewing typically were marketing people that got in because they saw a quick buck within this new growing category. Today we see people who are involved in contract brewing as a means to an end. And for me, I have a downward pressure on the retail shelf in pricing, and that session beer can't be above a certain dollar on the shelf. So if I need to be in a can, I need to be in a 6-pack and a 12-pack. And for me to be $15 in a 12-pack, I'm not building my own facility and cranking out 5,000 barrels and making any money. I mean, I need to share the scale of a contract brewer where we all pool together packaging, ingredients, and then I benefit from that scale, so I can then pass on that savings to the consumer in a 12-pack or whatever package variety I have. So for me, contract brewing was the only way I could get beer out of the gate at a reasonable price. I couldn't start with what JC did. I mean, if I started there, I would have come out with a 22 ounce at $8 with a 4% beer, and I wouldn't have sold, the second bottle. It just that model wouldn't work for me.
Is the model that you're in right now scalable and sustainable?
It's only scalable as long as I have options for contract brewing. I mean, right now, I brew at Two Roads in Connecticut, which is a wonderful contract partner. I really like the relationship I have with them. I'm brewing at Mercury in Ipswich, which I wouldn't be here without them. They helped me, they allowed me to go into the brewery and do basically anything I wanted except a sour beer, which was, it was creative, free-for-all, and I still have that ability. But the limiting factor in both of those are the available capacity I have within both of those breweries. And right now I have about 500 plus barrels per month at each at the combined facilities, and I'm not at ACBF this weekend because I don't have beer to serve. So that is the limiting factor for me, is the capacity issue. So I need to, I have partners that are now scaling and growing, contract partners, so the limiting factor is that I have to grow with them. So that, I think it's okay. It's not like I'm desperate for beer. I have enough beer to get through next week, and then the next truck comes in, and I'll make it just in time.
Right.
But it's definitely a challenge to be not in control of the capital purchases when you need them.
Separating yourself and perhaps even your own goals for Notch a little bit just from the brand, is Notch as a session beer brand, as Americana and all the things you talked about, is that something that's national for you in your mind? Just the brand itself, is that, even if it wasn't Notch, even if it was another brand that was session, is there room for that on a national level? Are buyers looking for that product?
I think there is. I think the whole session category has, as I talked about, I got in this because I thought session beer had an opportunity to become a significant portion of the craft beer market. And I know that sounds like a big, hairy, audacious goal, but it's the truth. In that, if you look at the consumption habits of those outside of craft beer, it's light, and light is 4.2%, and because that consumer wants to have multiple beers over an extended period of time and maintain some sobriety. And I know there's a craft beer consumer that thinks the exact same way, and I hear that all the time. Thank you for making session beer. So does that relate to a national brand? For me, then it becomes resources. How quickly can I roll it to new markets? How quickly can I have contract partners that can help me scale all that? And how do I gain those resources? Do I do debt? Do I do private equity? Do I do strategic partnerships? Those are very difficult decisions to make.
And things that you've thought about?
When I started Notch, I actually started that I thought this would be a strategic partnership. I didn't start this as an entrepreneur saying I'm going to come out with a session beer brand. I went to other breweries saying there's an opportunity to have a different brand within your own house. I'll manage, and let's run with it. Because I knew I wanted scale from production. I wanted distribution in multiple states, and no one would bite in 2009. So I said, F it, I'm going to do it myself. So here I am.
Going forward, would you consider a strategic option to get to that next step, to start moving regional and then perhaps national?
I think so. I think the best two options for me are private equity or a strategic partnership. Debt scares the shit out of me. It really does, because of the reason we saw in that graph earlier today. If we do have a shakeout, not a shakeout, if we have a downturn in demand and my business model is set up for X amount of sales and I don't meet that, I'm out of business if I have a lot of debt. So that really, I've been down there, I've lived through that before, and I'm not going to live through that again. So I think I'm not afraid of giving up equity as long as I retain the ability to do the things I want to do in the company.
And that'll help you get to a broader set of consumers and broader retail channels, you think?
Yeah, I think strategic partnership makes a lot of sense, but it has to be the right partner. I've seen some recent ones. I'm like, I'm not really sure that matches. Then I see others like What Happened to Boulevard, and said that makes all the sense in the world.
Are there ones that you admire?
Other brewers?
Yeah, or other strategic partnerships?
I mean, that one kind of sticks out right away. I mean, I think the Widmer distribution arrangement made a lot of sense to me. I mean, I have a lot of respect for those guys. They're pioneers, right? And they looked at it, wait, how do we get our beer in more people's hands and retain control of the company and do the things we want to do, which is brew beer, and not so much worry about distribution. And now they're kicked out of the club, of the BA, but I think they don't care. I think they made the best move they could make for their company.
Right. You talked about getting back to brewing the beer, and when we spoke the other day, you mentioned Mad Men and just getting back to work.
I don't want to be a spoiler for anyone who hasn't seen the last Mad Men episode, but
talk to me about what that means to you, about just getting to work and doing, the behind-the-scenes stuff of brewing and having someone that can execute on all those other levels that we've talked about all day long.
Yeah, I don't want to grow the company where I'm behind a desk and just managing paper and people. I got to that point a little bit with Tremont. I'm always going to be involved with the brewing, either hands-on or recipe development or production management, et cetera. And that's what I really love. That's what I do. I went to brewing school, and the whole litany of experience I have with brewing. And when I got back into it, I promised myself I wouldn't become just the CEO and president of a beer company that allots everyone else, manages everyone else. I got back into it because I wanted to be hands-on again. I miss brewing desperately. I mean, I really love brewing. And so that's always in the back of my head, that no matter what I do, I don't lose sight of that.
So to go big, to be national, it's going to take capital, it's going to take brewing resources, it's going to take a team of people probably around you to help do the things that maybe you don't desire to do on a daily basis. How do you foresee yourself getting over those hurdles and taking the next step?
For me, I've always had a strategy, and this is a strategy that is not unique in terms of how you grow the company, and that you have to get a little bit deep within your backyard, because we have to become profitable in our backyard. We have to make sure that we've worked out everything from the beers we brew to the packages we're available in, to our pricing, to our infrastructure, to make sure we've proved it out locally before I move to state number 2. And I don't think we're quite at the point yet where I've convinced we've worked everything out. It wasn't perfect when I launched because there was no one else to look at when I did this. There was no other session beer company I could look at and say, these guys kind of screwed up here, and this guy did this right, and let's kind of do an amalgamation of this and go. It was like, I got to figure it out as I go, and the only way to test anything is to try to sell it. And I did a lot of things wrong in the first year. And it was only until I got to this point this year I really felt like we're hitting stride in terms of our beers and cans. It's in 12 packs at a very affordable price. The styles I have, I'm really happy with. And I have a portfolio that I think we can roll out in other states, but it's 4 years down. So it took me that long to get here. I don't think it will take another 4 years to take a look at other expansion. But to answer your question, I think we're close to the point where we could say, all right, we're happy with Massachusetts. How are we going to finance, or how are we going to move into other states, and how are we going to roll out? But it took a long time to get to that point.
Right. Well, I think the phrase or the analogy that I've heard before is, it's the road less traveled for a reason, right? Don't look to other people for advice because they haven't been there before. So cheers to you for taking the road less traveled, and good luck.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Chris.
it.